Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's a leadership and AI performance innovator, 30 years Zen training, former regional head and compliance in global banking, and of course, an author too, none other than Mr. Edward Howard.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for the intro and thanks for
Welcome,
having me.
welcome. Yes, welcome, Mr. Edward, on Book 101 Review. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Sure, my name's Ed Howard. I'm from the northwest of England, just in between Liverpool and Manchester originally. I've been living in Singapore for about 10 years now, and I run a leadership training consultancy called Kokoro here in Singapore. And what that does is it brings together um, 20, 25 years of experience working in some of the biggest banks, Merrill Lynch, Societe Generale, SMBC, Standard Chartered here in Singapore, um, and 30 years of Zen training, which I began in Japan in round about 1996, 1997. Uh, and for a long time, I kept those two things separate until a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, where I decided to take what I had applied and tested and had success with and failed with in the banking world in terms of applying Zen training and come up with a framework to help leaders um, lead better, burn out, not burn out, and improve all sorts of other kind of leadership skills, emotional regulation, creativity, decision making, that kind of thing.
Well said, Mr. Ed. And here on Book 101 Review, we salute you, we celebrate you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to us, as well to the world. Thank you. So today, let's talk about all the hats that we mentioned. You've distilled 30 years of Zen training and 20 years of banking into a single conscious breath. That's a radical simplification. What convinced that your one breath is just one could enough to interrupt the reactive loop?
So I kind of worked backwards from it, and part of the what drove me in this direction was, mindfulness and meditation has become much more widespread in the last 20 years or so. Um, but a lot of people really struggle with it. They, you know, number one, it is quite difficult when you first start to do it, especially if you try and sit for, 5, 10, 15 minutes. What people experience is their mind kind of goes into overdrive and they can't settle and can't relax. And so I wanted to, create a kind of gateway or bridge from those Eastern meditative traditions uh, for people who are working in a corporate environment or a business environment or just uh, in their daily lives that is is less daunting and it is less difficult to start with, and so that famous saying about a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. That's really what One Breath Leadership is doing. But interestingly, um, there's stories throughout the Zen tradition of people, um, understanding themselves or having breakthroughs, or insight, as it's called in the scientific literature, and that only taking a second. So, the backing was there in terms of the history and so on. I just needed to build a scientific case that backed that up. And the second thing is that meditation becomes another thing on the list of things we should be doing, and I think most people, if you're human and you have a big list of things to do, you tend to drop the things that maybe you're not looking forward to, or you're finding, or you're going to find difficult. So it's easy to skip the gym, or it's easy to skip eating healthily, but it's really difficult to skip breathing. And so that's the whole design principle, is that I'm not asking people to build a new habit from nothing at all. I'm basically hijacking a thing that you do, I think, 22,000 times a day. And so when you can tap into that in just, the space of one breath, or 10 or 12 seconds, it becomes much easier to build that habit, and people see changes, or they see a difference the first time they do it, and then as they begin to stack it over time and do it more often, then kind of deeper change begins to happen.
You call your approach mind or mindlessness rather than mindfulness. That's deliberately provocative. What is the distinction, and why does the goal mindfulness is actually create more pressure for already overwhelmed leaders?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to that thing of having another thing to do, on very busy people's lists, and so most leadership training or management training or training of any kind adds things on to an already packed schedule, or packed mind in terms of things to do. So the mindlessness thing is really emphasizing that what can be done, is reduce that load. So you're essentially giving yourself a 10 to 12 second break, or a 10 to 12 second opportunity to reduce that cognitive load, and actually switch something off rather than switch something on. So again, that comes directly from the Zen teachings. A single breath interrupts that loop of thinking and deciding, or judging, comparing, reacting. You interrupt that loop, you step out of your ordinary operating system into something more spacious, which is known as no mind in Zen. So it's not blank, it's not switched off, it's just unhooked from your next reaction, or your next thought. And so that's what I call mindlessness. You're not trying to focus harder. You're dropping the noise for long enough to let your actual judgment come back online.
You've said most meditation practices were built for monasteries, not trading floors. What specifically did not translate from the monastery to the bank, and what did you strip away to make it work?
Um, yeah, so I think the meditative traditions, certainly in the East, whether it is Indian or Chinese or Korean or Japanese or Vietnamese or whatever, those guys, 1500, 2000 years ago, built the perfect conditions of quietness to practice, introspection or meditation. And when you have less inputs, less demands on you in terms of, um, work or demands on your attention or whatever, and you're in, a forest or up a mountain or in a peaceful minimalist temple, of course that's going to help you kind of access these states. But most of us in, North America or Europe or, even the big cities in Asia don't have that luxury, and we also, most of us have got to work and earn money and so on, and so that kind of situation or those conditions aren't readily accessible. So that's really what drove me stripping away, what exactly is the meditative process? What actually have people been doing for, 2,000, 3,000, maybe even 10,000 years in terms of this process? And that boils down to kind of three things, really. And it's what their mind is doing, what they're doing with their breath, and what they're putting their attention on. So mind, breath, and attention are the three keys to this process and any kind of sort of meditative process. And so I think once you understand that and realize that, you can then start to work with that. Whether you're on a really busy bus or commuter train, or in the back of a cab on your way to work, when you're in the elevator and you push the button, to go to your floor to begin work, when you sit down at your desk. And so there's all these ordinary occurrences that happen in our lives every day, that we can anchor this process onto or hook this process onto. And that means that maybe we're not sitting, in a mountain hut or in a monastery for 5 or for 30 or 40 minutes, but we can do this one single breath technique multiple times a day, and as you practice it more, it just becomes second nature. And there's, without the meditative aspect, there's big sort of physiological or physical benefits of breathing in this way. It lowers your cortisol and stress hormones. It activates what's known as your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that calms you down. It also, if you're able to breathe through your nose, it filters the air better, so you're less likely to be breathing in germs and so on. And so, that's the kind of starting point. And the old traditions must have known all this, all that time ago. But we're only discovering some of it now, and so, or rather, rediscovering it now. So I think by giving people that knowledge and understanding, one, they can see the kind of benefit in it sort of immediately, and then two, they can slot it in or make it part of their ordinary day, which makes it much easier to to do.
Well said, Mr. Ed. The method attracts us to the moments people already pass through the day, the 10 seconds between parking the car and walking into the office. Why is anchoring the exiting transition more effective than asking someone to carve out a 20 minutes of new time?
I think it's because number one, it's shorter, and if you look at the research on habit forming and habit building, doing small things often, it's much easier to create habits and rewire, how your brain or mind works in those very short bite-sized pieces than it is committing to something that takes longer or that feels bigger or feels more intimidating or difficult. And then the second thing is that it's just easier to you have more opportunity to do that during the day. As I mentioned, you're probably breathing 22,000 times a day. So the hope is that when you understand the method and you understand how to do it, I mean, all of us experience stress on a daily basis, whether it's a boss or a work colleague or somebody that cuts you off in traffic or somebody that steps on your foot on the train or your wife or husband driving you mad by pushing your buttons. So that those opportunities will always be at the front of your mind. And to start with, you're probably going to remember to do the breath after one of those things has happened. But again, that's taking that one step, and so pretty soon you'll be doing it more regularly, and that's what builds the habit over time.
Indeed, habits for sure. You spent 20 years rising the regional head of compliance in the global investment banking while simultaneously training in the Zen tradition, including living in Japan and formal ordination. These are two worlds seems like they exist on different planets. What did each world give you that the other could not?
Um, well, I, where I've ended up. If we start from the sort of end and work backwards, is I realized that the two things weren't separate. That uh, um, living consciously or working consciously uh, are are the same thing, and you can do that in the moment. I think my mistake, and I think this is something that a lot of people maybe do if they have a spiritual practice or a meditative practice, is they treat them separately. So I, it took me a long time for those two things to come together. Probably because I'm stubborn. Probably because my understanding wasn't what it should have been. But I like to think, or this is the story I tell myself, that it was almost like rubbing two, banging two stones together, and eventually, the spark was there, and I realised that the two things could come together. So, part of the reason that I wrote the book was, to put that out there and explain that to people, so uh, they don't have to spend 20, 25 years with these two aspects fighting together. They can bring them together. You know, it right now and in the moment. And it doesn't have to be you don't have to see it as a spiritual practice or a meditative practice. It's really a technique that anybody can use. It doesn't matter. And so that's why I stripped it right back, so that it would be accessible to anyone, and as many people that found it useful.
Well said, Mr. Ad. You've said the goal is to help leaders stay fully human in an age that keeps asking them to operate like machines. What does it look like when a leader does lose their humanity at work, and how do they recognize it before it's too late?
What does it look like when they lose their humanity? Humanity. I think making decisions purely without kind of self-awareness. So, very egoic decision making that's based on what will benefit themselves the most, rather than the other people in the room or the rest of the company, or even broader than that. Um, a kind of lack of understanding of the people who they work with, point of view. I mean, you're not always going to agree with people. In fact, very often you're not going to agree with people when you're making critical decisions in business. But I think if you inject humanity into those decisions, they end up being better. They end up being more kind of open and wide ranging, rather than coming from a place of this is all about my career or my point of view. And also when you're more open, you're much more likely to hear a better idea or a different view from your own, and quite often that is where the good stuff happens. So yeah, I think that's it really in a nutshell. But I think there's also physiological signs that will give you away when you're losing your humanity. So um, feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, all those classic sort of mental health symptoms that, recent studies have said that 76% of C-suite people working at C-suite level are suffering with some kind of form of mental health issue. Poor sleep, that again, that can be a warning sign as well. Not getting on with people, being short-tempered, all these things tend to be signs that you're not operating in the best in the kind of best way possible. And so anybody that is kind of feeling those things or doing those things, the one breath technique gives them something that can help them with that, provided they want to change, and they want to lead better.
Mr. Ad, to wrap up our discussion for today, your book, One Breath Leadership, launched globally in June 2026. What was the hardest chapter to write, and what did the writing teach you about your own method?
The hardest chapter to write was, I come from a social sciences background, um, I did politics at university, and then I did Japanese, and then I did law. So I hadn't done a lot of science for a long time, and I thought it was really important to understand the science of the one breath method. So I think the science parts around what the mind is doing and what the brain is doing and the body, those were probably the difficult ones. So I think chapter 2, mind and chapter 1, which is breath. Those two were probably the most difficult. What was the second part of the question again, Daniel?
Well, which is hardest to write and which chapter?
Which chapter? Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think the first two chapters, breath and mind, because of that, the need to get my head around the science and some big words or names for parts of the brain that I previously hadn't ever thought about.
Well said, Mr. Ed. And can you please invite our listeners to support One Breath Leadership or anything you want to promote on Book 101 Review?
Sure. If you're interested in the book, it's available on Amazon. One Breath Leadership. If you type that in, it's available everywhere in Kindle, paperback, hardback, and also the audiobook. If you want to contact me about training or keynote speaking or whatever, you can go to onebreathleadership.com. And there's a form there to get in touch. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, so Edward Howard on LinkedIn. You can find me there.
Definitely, yes. Let's connect with Mr. Ed. I have more question before I will let you go. You build a leadership system from the collision of an ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience. As you look ahead, what is the next frontier for this work? The question you're still asking that the current method does not yet fully answer.
That's a good question, Daniel. I think the biggest question for me is how to make this widespread, because it's so effective that anybody that tries it or learns about it, will benefit from it. So, yeah, the big question is how to keep getting this out there and get people trying it is the big one.
Well, Mr. Ed Howard, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Daniel.
Bodycon people, see you soon. Well, again, thank you, Mr. Ed, and I will invite